Hey, welcome to Tales from the Troll Hole. I'm your host, Cecil Beee, and together we're going to dive deep into the internet and find what stories there are to be read, enjoyed, laughed at, cried with, you name it. Thanks for coming along on this journey with me. Now grab your torch and pitchfork. Let's dive into this troll hole. Hello, it is I, Cecil Beee. I am here with my peppermint tea to tell stories unto thee. Hee hee hee. This week, our theme is UFOs, unidentified flying objects, and stories of people who have seen, interacted, or had other contact with UFOs. But first, we have a listener story about the Halloween episode. They have sent in a very spooky story of their own, so I would love to read that. I'm going to call this person Veronica. Veronica says, "So I just listened to your Halloween podcast. When my ex was in treatment, he saw a ghost of a girl that would peer out from behind the trees outside. I guess other people had seen it too. Another time, my ex was at a sweat lodge treatment center. He would wake up super early to sit in the main common area and drink coffee before the other patients woke up just to have some quiet time. He witnessed a black mass crawl across the floor that was the size of an alligator. I would think he was nuts if I hadn't been with him when I saw a huge fucking UFO in the front yard at my mom's house. I was in the house, and I had just closed the window above my son's crib that he was asleep in. I told my ex, I don't like to leave this window open at night because it makes me afraid aliens are going to try to snatch him in the middle of the night. We went into my room and then outside to smoke. This huge luminescent saucer with about 40 glowing panels of light just appears over the neighbor's house. He was terrified. He whispered, 'Veronica, what am I looking at right now?' And I started hopping up and down saying, 'Ha! I told you they were real!' We watched for about a minute in complete shock, and then this fucking thing cloaked itself into the background of the starry sky." Wow, Veronica, that was great. Thank you so much. You also sent some really interesting other stories too. I can't wait to dive into those on other episodes. Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, UFOs, totally real. And I think I've seen a similar one. I'm gonna talk about my story later on, but that was a good twofer. You gave me a spooky ghost story and a UFO story. Thank you. Terrific. Perfection. All right, so to get into this episode, I'm going to read some stories from Reddit about asking people their interactions with UFOs. Now, UFO, it doesn't always mean like alien flying saucer, right? It just means unidentified flying object. But most of us think alien UFO when we hear it. So that's kind of the definition I'm going with. This story comes from Zealous Ideal Degree 4 on Reddit. I was driving to Las Vegas and had given myself 2 extra hours for my flight. I remember a bright light behind me and was annoyed. Next second, I'm an hour later, 30 miles in the wrong direction. I turned around and drove back, could barely keep my eyes open and barely had time to park and fly. It was so weird. Damn, that sounds like memory wiping, first of all, and that maybe they got picked up by said UFO and then put back in approximately the same area. Like what I'm thinking of is like when you pick up a ladybug and you're like, oh yes, hello ladybug. And then you put it down. And to you put it down like pretty much in the same spot. But to the ladybug, it's like, what the fuck just happened? I'm like 10 miles from where I needed to be. Ladybug miles, that is. I wonder what the ratio to ladybug miles to human miles is. Jury's out on that one. Oh, further down in the comments, they said that their eyes were very red also, like when they came back to it. And then other people say that red eyes may not be unrelated. Many alleged abductees have reported the same thing. That's very interesting. Maybe you're like exposed to different kinds of lights or different levels of moisture in the air or something. It's hard to say. I can speculate so much. I'm a master speculator. Somebody else in the comments said narcolepsy. And I mean, maybe, but if they don't have a history of it and it hasn't been brought up, like it hasn't happened again, I don't know if there's like single instances of narcolepsy, right? And even so, how would you drive in the opposite direction while you were asleep? I don't know. I've heard of things like that happening like on Ambien. People do all kinds of things. But if this person was going to the airport, I doubt that they had Ambiened. Bed, bath, Ambien. The next story comes from Aghast Cornicon. Last night, I saw a Starlink satellite row pass overhead, and I swear it looked like it was barely 1,000 feet up and 500 feet long. I just couldn't reconcile what my eyes were telling me with my knowledge that glowing lights moving slowly and silently overhead are not a thing. I was really close to shouting at my neighbors, "Hey, get out here, look at this, what is that?" I went inside and told my wife, and the dogs were freaking out, and she didn't seem to care that my whole world had shifted because I'd seen something that I could not explain. Then I went inside and Googled. That is so funny because that exact same thing happened to me a few months ago. The first time I saw the Starlink satellites, I was out walking my dogs, and I'm just always looking up at the sky because I love the sky. I love stars, planets, space. I love all of that shit. So I was looking, as I do, and then all of a sudden I see the Starlink line, and I was mystified, kind of afraid, got a little nauseous, but then I got out my phone and looked it up, and I think what I actually searched was a bunch of satellites in a row, because I was like, what is that? But then I was like, darn, just Starlink. This next story comes from an esteemed cactus, also on Reddit. We were homeless for a bit in Oklahoma. The things that happened out in the area we lived in were wild. I don't particularly believe in aliens visiting us or anything. I believe they probably exist on some level, but not the visiting Earth and abducting people kind. I fully believe what we saw was some sort of military exercise. We all woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like a jet engine right above us. We all start freaking out and watched as these two things way up in the sky danced around shooting at one another until one finally went down. It didn't explode or break apart. It was hit by something and a part of it was burning, so it sort of coasted down until we couldn't see it anymore. Nothing ever showed up in the news. No crash sites. Nothing. But all of us can remember the distinct sound of gunfire and how loud they were as they coasted back and forth. It was honestly kind of beautiful to see, if not absolutely terrifying to wake up to. Wow. Yeah, that's kind of what I would imagine, the kind of fear where you just are silent and staring and you can't feel the fear yet, but you're just locked in the present and experiencing it so viscerally that you can't feel what's coming, but you know the emotions will come, but they're not here yet. You know what I mean? Turbo fear. I think that's the clinical term for that. Wow. And just to be like out in it, like where you can't go anywhere else. You're just in it. Like, wow, that had to have been so scary. I'm glad that you did not get abducted, and I'm glad that nothing terrible happened. Oh my goodness. The next story comes from Stinging Nettles McGee. So I have insomnia, and one night I was staying around my parents who live in the middle of the British countryside. They are quite literally surrounded by fields. And about 2 a.m., these really low vibrating, humming sounds started coming from outside. It got louder and louder until it literally sounded like there was a helicopter. It happened in the space of about 2 minutes, or something about to land on the roof. Then there was a series of lights sort of flashing, but they moved quickly upwards at the same time. That lasted for about 10 seconds until it all just stopped. Dead silent. I was literally frozen. I still have no idea to this day what happened, and I am yet to experience anything similar. The only explanation I can think of is extraterrestrials. Someone in the comments says that sound carries ages in the countryside at night, probably a helicopter, and the sound was pushed by the wind. You know, I can see that being plausible, but what about the lights? That doesn't really add up, you know? I'm all for skepticism. I think it's very important to think logically and explore all the angles of something before you just attach yourself to one explanation. So the helicopter theory is interesting. I would love to see a Mythbusters on this. Is that show even still on? The next story is from Negative Caps. 1997, Colorado Springs, Colorado. I was 8 years old, playing in the sand volleyball court at the park down the street from my house. I was engrossed in my activity, burying my collection of Happy Meal toys in the sand and then digging them back out. Repeat. I was looking down, but decided suddenly that I needed to look up because the world around me had lost all sound. There was no longer any ambient noise, no traffic noise from the busy streets just a block over, no more dogs barking, no more birds chirping. I looked at the street that bordered the park, and that is when I saw it. It looked like a stealth bomber turned sideways, nose leading, one wing down toward the road and the other pointed up at the sky. Okay, I see. Completely shiny black in color, as tall as a house and shaped like an arrowhead. It was cruising the street at 3 miles an hour, just gliding over the road. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds. As soon as it had passed behind some 2-story houses and out of my sight, I got my hearing back full force. I ran home with piss-soaked pants and never spoke a word of it to anybody. Oh my gosh, they made a sketch of the thing they saw. Hang on, I'm gonna go look. Yeah, wow, that's creepy. I mean, the drawing that they made of themselves in the sandbox is spectacular, but that's exactly what I was picturing. Dang, that is really cool. And that's the kind of thing, it's like you can't really disprove it, because even if it was just like a super advanced military thing, what the fuck were they doing? That's still unidentified, still a flying object, still a UFO. Fight me. Not literally. I will run. All right, our next story comes from T-Bat Work. I occasionally suffer from sleep paralysis. Ooh. It developed in my early 20s, and I've had the alien abduction dream. My dad and I love to watch shows about aliens, so I assume people who claim they were abducted have some form of sleep paralysis. It started with flashes of blue light, and I felt myself being lifted out of bed by the chest. I was blinded by white light, and I could hear loud mechanical whirring. When I woke up, I was sitting up in bed with my chest stuck out, and my arms were holding me up. The experience was the most intense sleep paralysis dream I've ever had. I can see how someone else could have that dream, panic, and tell everyone about it. That's really interesting. The sleep paralysis and night terrors. I mean, I know people who have those, and they say that a lot of the times they are convinced it is 1,000% real. But then there's other times people who have sleep paralysis have that happen to them, and they know that it's happening, but they just can't stop it from happening. It's almost like they're lucid nightmaring, you know? That's got to be such a scary and awful experience to have. But it sounds like T-Bat Work has some awareness to it, so maybe they're not as horribly affected by it, or maybe being aware of it is worse. I really don't know. Either way, that does seem a plausible explanation. Alternatively, perhaps it was aliens. We'll never know, unless we do at some point. This next story is from a deleted user. I was on a wildfire just south of Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. We were in fire rigs driving to the incident area, 4 trucks in close convoy when we heard helicopters. 8 black military choppers escorted us in formation like 10 miles. We assumed they were just doing drills and using us for a fake target practice or something. A little while later, we are parked and about to start hiking to the fire line when suddenly a thin column of smoke shoots probably about 200 feet in the sky. It was a good mile away, but the concussion was pretty significant when it hit us, and the noise was still ridiculously loud. We thought it was probably no big deal. We knew we were near a strike zone. A good 5 minutes later, an aircraft like nothing I have ever seen flew by us at maybe 500 feet. It was flat black and sort of rectangular, but with fins and wells on the other side. On the underside. It was moving pretty slow and was dead silent, so I have to assume it was some sort of stealth glider. It sounds ridiculous, but it immediately reminded me of a huge flying Batmobile, Tim Burton era. Okay. After that, some military personnel got on our radio frequency and instructed us to leave the area immediately. When our crew chief asked who it was and why they signed off, and the inciting incident commander, the guy in charge of managing the entire situation, came on the radios and said we were evacuating the area. They sent us to a completely different fire about 100 miles to the south and never told us why, except that it was higher priority, which was bullshit. It was already out when we got there, and we just assisted crews in the mop-up operation. The thing that confuses me about this is that if the Army didn't want us to see that shit, or if it was dangerous, why didn't they keep us clear of the area in the first place? Either a communications breakdown, or they had a now shit situation going down and just had to get us out of there without warning. There's a link at the bottom that says, this is the closest thing anybody has suggested. Oh, I am intrigued. Hang on, I'll be right back. Oh, cool. It's like a model, sort of like mock-up of the aircraft that it could have been. And it does look like what they were describing, like flat black with like wells on the bottom. I'm not seeing the Tim Burton Batmobile, but I can see maybe in the dark how they would have thought it maybe, but it does kind of look like a super futuristic, maybe military plane. That's crazy though. You're going to put out a wildfire, so you're already primed for like a natural disaster, and then you see a completely unnatural disaster and get no answers. Man, that would start a fire in my brain that would not be able to be put out. This next story is from Hero to Dusk, and I believe this one happened in Australia. One time when I was like 10, I was driving with my dad on the M7 and there was a circular red cloud in the sky. It was slowly moving and then shot up really fast and then disappeared. I remember my little bro in the back was hysterical. If memory serves, people had slowed down to look at it, though I've never heard anything about it since. Oh, that's just giving me vibes of the movie Nope. Ew. That one is... If you're afraid of aliens, do not watch that movie. I'm not even afraid of aliens, and that movie scared the shit out of me. All right, this next story is a full-on abduction story. And this is from Daenerys on Reddit. This happened to me when I was 10 years old in Calgary, Alberta in 1970. I was walking home from school, cutting across the sports field. Our house wasn't far. We lived across the street from the school. There wasn't any other kids there since I had stayed late for a volleyball practice, and the rest of the students had gone home 45 minutes earlier when the school let out for the day. It's about 4:30 in the afternoon. Something caught my attention from the corner of my eye, and I stopped to turn to the right to look at it. Floating directly above a house facing schoolyard was a large UFO. I was in the middle of the football field, so this is about 60 to 70 yards distant from where I stood. The UFO is big and almost touching the roof of the house. It is completely centered on the house, but it is so big, it is also above the house on the left and the right. The lots were 50 feet wide, which puts the UFO about 150 feet across and perhaps 25 to 30 feet tall. It is very bright, giving off a harsh white light, which is difficult to look at since it hurts my eyes. On the way back towards my house, I see a car and a motorcycle on the other side of the street, which intersects the street with the UFO. That street is about half a block away, and I remember being surprised and confused that the drivers are not reacting to the UFO, which clearly must have been visible to them and so obvious since it was so bright, but the traffic continues as normal. At that point, I become aware that something is forcing me to turn my head back towards the UFO. I'm turning, my field of view is changing, but I'm not the one doing it. I struggle to turn away, but I simply can't control any of my body. I remember feeling panic, and the next thing I can remember, I'm walking into my house. It's about 9:30 at night and dark outside. I can't recall anything of the last 5 hours. My parents were furious with me for being so late. Apparently, my parents and my 2 brothers had been trying to find me for hours. A voice/thought in my head tells me that I should tell them that I'm not feeling well and I need to go to bed. I have no idea where that voice/thought came from, but I do exactly as it suggests and I run upstairs to my room and go to bed. The next day, I still can't seem to explain what happened, and my mother is even more angry with me since my new school shoes are ruined, since the tops of them are all scuffed and dirty, like I was dragged face down across the ground with my feet still dragging on the ground. Ugh. I told my brothers what happened, and they suggested I keep quiet about it since nobody would believe me. Good advice, as it turns out, since in the many years since, most people I have shared the story with don't really know what to say afterward. Many years later, I was looking at my old school workbooks from that time, and they are full of drawings of UFOs, all of the same design and with more detail than I can recall from memory. For example, in my memory, I can't remember seeing any windows in the UFO since the light was too bright to make out any details, but in my drawings, there were large round windows all around the UFO with some faces looking out. That's really cool. Super eerie, too. They also included a picture of like the closest reference photo they could find for what they saw. And that's really neat. With all the little windows, it is creepy to imagine little faces popping out, though. Ugh. And my inner skeptic is trying to find something that could have happened that was not an abduction, like maybe some sort of injury, head injury that happened all of a sudden. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly, but that's a really mysterious story. It must be so frustrating to have something like that happen and not have any answers, like any concrete answers, you know? The next story comes from Topsy Kretz. I see what you did there. My fiance, boyfriend at the time, had just gotten home from work. He went into our kitchen and I walked through the bedroom into the bathroom and just stopped for a moment. I had a weird feeling. I still can't really put a name on it. So I called to him and asked him to come here. I walked out of the bedroom, and as soon as we came within view of each other, that was it. The next thing we knew, we were both waking up, laying side by side on our bed, flat on our backs, and on the top of the blankets, and still fully dressed down to our shoes. 3 hours had gone by. It was so odd and disorienting, and though we had just both come to, we were extremely tired. We joked about the lost time at first, but the more we thought about it, the more weirded out we became about the whole ordeal. This isn't proof for anything, but I've never been able to think of anything else it could have been. Yeah, that's another odd one. I'm curious to know, I know that carbon monoxide poisoning can do something, like it makes you hallucinate or have time loss. I wonder if that could have been something. It's hard to say. Also, I'm wondering if there was like any parts of the memories that were missing, like leading up to it, like if there were any lights or weird noises or vibrations or anything. That's fascinating though. Our next story is from Nerdy by Nature. Was camping in a campground in North Georgia with some friends. It was starting to downpour, so everyone left their tents in the woods and decided to rent one of those on-site cabins for everyone to sleep in. I decided I'd just sleep in my car because they wanted to stay up late and I was tired from kayaking all day. I woke up to the rain stopping and it was kind of cold in the car, and I had forgotten my sleeping bag in my tent. I checked the cabin to see if there was any room left, and the light was on and everyone was fast asleep, 3 a.m. I didn't want to squeeze in, so I decided to trek my way to my tent in the dark with a small pen light. In order to get to my tent, I had to pass by everyone's tents that they had left. Mine was the last one, and even then was 50 feet at least from the previous tent before it. I got in my tent, covered up with my sleeping bag, and prepared to catch the last few hours of sleep before sunrise. No more than 10 to 15 minutes from me getting into my tent, I begin to hear light whispers right outside the tent door. They weren't in English, and to my recollection, indecipherable, not in any language I had heard at all. Just as the voices started, 2 orbs appeared together outside the tent. They aren't the same glare as a flashlight would make, and both were of different colors that, to the best of my ability, were not really any distinct color, just colorful. The whispers outside the tent began arguing louder between each other, but still in a hushed tone. And as the whispers grew louder, the lights began swirling around the tent, behind me, to the side, and to the front. Not in the movement that one could make with flashlights, and at this point I realized no footsteps could be heard. I uncovered myself and knelt on the tent floor, preparing for the zipper to become undone, just like in a horror movie, and I was flipping through my mind on what option to take. I was the most terrified I'd ever been, fight or flight. The lights swirled faster and the voices grew louder, but still breathy and whispery. My mind raced and I was sweating despite the cold. And then, just like that, the lights shut off like a switch and the whispers stopped, and left nothing but the silence of an empty wood. I stood there as still as I could and didn't dare go outside that tent until the sun came up. It was and is still the scariest moment of my life. I hope this makes sense. I've never written it out before. Okay. And looks like they say, interestingly enough, I went to a horror movie premiere recently and there was a scene that had the voices in it and goosebumps ran up my arm. It was identical. Apparently the movie was Beacon Point. That's so scary. I mean, being in the woods and being the only one awake among your friend or family group is already terrifying, let alone realizing that you're not alone when you think that you should be. That's probably the scariest thing of all. The top comment underneath this story is, I would have pulled the sleeping bag over my head and died. Okay, we have another listener story. This one is from someone who wanted to remain anonymous. My wife and I were out walking our dogs one winter night when we went to a park and we were looking up at the sky. It was pretty clear out and we could see all the stars and we were just looking and seeing if we could see shooting stars or satellites or something like that. I'm staring up and I start to see something that looks like a triangle that is lined with lights. It's a black triangle, but you can tell that it's there because it's blocking out the stars behind it as it's moving. And I'm just staring at it and I call my wife over and I ask her, does she see this? And she looks up and she sees it too. And it's moving at a very, very slow rate, almost like it's unnaturally slow. It doesn't look like it's as high up as an airplane, but it's hard to tell the scale of it from where we were standing and how the lights were interacting with everything around it. After a few moments of staring at it in silence, we see it start to take off extremely fast, and then it's gone. We walked back home in stunned silence and then tried to look it up on the internet to no avail. That's interesting because I feel like I've seen things about triangle spaceships. There's the classic like circular flying saucer, but then I feel like so many of them are triangular or pyramid, or there's just something about the geometric shapes that maybe it's because they have to do with math and math is not bound to a language specifically. I have a feeling that these geometric shapes are the calling card of the universal language whenever we figure out what it is. Okay, so my own personal UFO story is that I was sitting on a porch, my friend's porch, because there was a party going on. So I was sitting on the porch because I'm not really a person who's big on like crowds. So I was having some quiet time on the porch. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. And it was in the middle of summer. And I was just kind of looking up at the stars and I could see a big bright orange one. And I was thinking, I don't remember seeing that before because it wasn't one of the planets, because it was even bigger than when you can see Venus or something, you know, but it was really bright orange. And then all of a sudden it started moving in these strange like zigzag and like circular patterns, and it would change speeds, and it was just the one light, so I knew it wasn't an airplane or anything I'd seen before. And this was before you could just like buy drones and fly them around. This was a long time ago. And then as I'm watching it, I'm starting to freak out a little bit, and then all of a sudden it just like takes off and zooms like so far away and gets smaller and smaller and smaller and disappears. And I ran into that house and was like, was anybody looking out the window? Did anybody see that shit? But I'm always hoping to see something like that again, but I just haven't. But maybe someday. That's why I'm always looking up when I go outside. I want to see it again. Well, there we have it, folks. That's our UFO episode in the books. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had a great time listening. And if you have any fun UFO stories, it's not too late. Send them to me. I would love to read them on the podcast, and let's talk about it. Let's talk about the weird and wonderful world of space and all the creatures in it. Also, one cool thing to note is that we are in space all the time. People always think it'd be so cool to go to space. bruh, we are already there. We've been here the whole time. So if you're ever having a bad day, just remember, you are in space right now, which makes you an astronaut. Congratulations. All right, everybody, we will see you next week. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for listening to Tales from the Troll Hole. I'm your host, Cecil Beee, and this show is produced by me. Our theme song is by Vervex. They're a great band. You should give them a listen. You can stream them anywhere. They're also on TikTok and Instagram. Remember to subscribe so that you don't miss out on a single episode. And also find us on Instagram, and then you can send in your own stories. I just ask that they're true and that they're not going to scar somebody for life. You know what I mean? Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.